Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Hello, and welcome to Shining Moon, a speculative fiction podcast, episode 12. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. Today, we'll continue our series by talking about what differentiates contemporary fantasy as a genre from its cousin, urban fantasy, and more. My guests this week are Laurence Brothers, Michael Haynes, and Sheila Massie. Laurence Raphael Brothers is a writer and technologist with 5 patents and a background in AI and internet R&D. He has published over 50 short stories in such magazines as Nature, Podcastle, and Galaxy's Edge. His noir urban fantasy novella series consisting of The Demons of Wall Street, The Demons of the Square Mile, The Demons of Coyotea, and has just added a new volume, The Demons of Montmartre, while his standalone novel, The World's Shattered Shell, has also recently been published. Hello, Laurence, and welcome back to the podcast. How are you today?
Doing fine, thanks. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's a pleasure to have you. Michael Haynes lives in central Ohio, where he works on database systems running by day and puts his characters through the ringer by night. An ardent short story reader and writer with nearly 100 published stories, his debut collection, At the Intersection of Love and Death, is available now. He serves on the board of Rainbow Dublin, an LGBTQIA+ advocacy group, and enjoys photography, cooking, and travel. Find him online at michaelhaynes.info. Thank you, Michael, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Looking forward to it.
Sheila Massie writes speculative fiction, both dark and hopeful, so she can play with monsters, ghosts, beasts, and magic. She works professionally as an international instructor in the field of gender-based violence prevention and holds a 4th-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Her can't live without it list includes cheese, tea, and pizza, all of which I approve. She lives in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, with her husband and her brat of a miniature Rottweiler. Find out more about her at SheilaMassie.com. Hello, Sheila, and welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's lovely to have you. Right, we're going to jump right into our first question, which is, what is urban fantasy? Is it solely a marketing term? How does it differ from contemporary fantasy? And I'm going to start with Laurence because I'm sure he has opinions about this.
Yeah, it's really problematic, all these industry and genre definitions, because they're so fuzzy and they also change and evolve over time. So I think to begin with, when the phrase was first coined, I'm guessing the 80s or 90s, not sure, but it was just a way of categorizing contemporary fantasy, as it were.
Yeah.
But certain tropes became conventional within the category. Certain writers became very prominent by using certain tropes.
Yes.
So we had some expectations being set up for the phrase, and then with romance categorizing many subgenres of its own, it developed an urban fantasy subcategory of the romance structured story. And I think that while there's still a kind of bimodal usage of the term, partly within science fiction and fantasy and partly within romance, there's been some sort of cross-pollination there. So there's a lot of romancy expectations in urban fantasy, even when it's not within the romance structure. But it's complicated.
A lot of these genre conversations that we've had have had a lot of nuance to them, a lot of complications. Michael, would you like to add anything to that definition?
Yeah, when we were talking about this originally, I was thinking about how I might differentiate urban fantasy from contemporary fantasy. And at least for me, when I'm reading, something that makes something feel like urban fantasy to me is if the city is important to the story in some way, almost
Mhm.
almost like another character in the story.
Ooh.
This is outside the spec fic genre, but one of my favorite crime writers is Laurence Block, and I feel like he does a really great job, especially in his Matthew Scudder novels, of having New York City be integral to the story. You couldn't tell those stories somewhere else.
Mhm.
And when I'm thinking about urban fantasy, to me, that feels like a really important piece, that you couldn't take this story and set it in a rural setting or a suburb and have it be the same. That there are aspects of city life that are core to the story.
Okay, I like that. That is a very good definitional axes that we can pursue here. Sheila, for you, is there a distinction in your between contemporary and urban fantasy that you would like to pursue in terms of this conversation?
I think one of the interesting things would be to think about the inherent conflict that I see in urban fantasy between the magical world and the air quotes real world that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily exist in strictly contemporary fantasy, where the source of the
Yeah.
conflict can be elsewhere. But in urban
Mm-hmm.
fantasy, there's almost always people with one foot in both worlds, and
Yes.
that is part of the source of the conflict for most of what I would consider urban fantasy, as well as kind of a dark aesthetic and kind of a gritty nature would that
Mm-hmm.
again in contemporary fantasy wouldn't necessarily appear.
I love
All
both
right.
those points.
Those are great points. These are all things I hadn't even thought of, so this is wonderful. I love having my definitions expanded. I love having my knowledge base expanded, so thank you all very much. We already talked a little bit about the expectation of romance tropes, and the Dresden Files is basically for me the gold standard of urban fantasy, in that it's set in the modern world, but it's a solidly fantasy setting. It has one of the prototypical trope definers. There is that you have a PI character investigating things that other people can't go into, that sort of thing. How significant for you is the role of the private investigator or the detective in your work? And I know that Laurence writes extensively with a private investigator. So how do you play with this trope? How do you subvert it? How do you work with it?
So that's another involved and interesting question. Another genre contamination source is noir.
Mm-hmm.
Noir, and you can, there's there's a bit of a metaphor there. I think it's a bit strained, but noir looks at the underside of life that, let us say, ordinary citizens, readers, only have passing contact with more than likely. Um,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of urban fantasy, whether or not there's anything like an investigator, suggests that there's another side of the world, another reality. It's the interpenetration of angels and demons, or secret wizard cabals, or whatever it might be. There's something emergent into our commonplace world. As Sheila mentioned, too, there's that tension. So, the role of the investigator who crosses between these worlds and whose job it is to look into them, it seems like it's core to a number of different types of story that can be told within that category.
Mm-hmm. Michael, when you write in the contemporary world, do you ever wind up making use of your interest in noir and detective stories, or is this something that is a disparate category for you?
Yeah, oddly enough, I really haven't. I really like what Laurence was saying there, though, about how both noir and urban fantasy, you get that idea of seeing a side of the world that not everyone is seeing. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, the only time that I've actually worked with a detective or private investigator character in a spec fic type story, interestingly, Deborah, I just noticed today when I was looking at the publication of it, you were in the same issue of the magazine.
I was.
Yep. So I had a story I wrote quite a few years back, and it was published 2020 maybe or thereabouts. And it's called Acme Dendon Out of Time. And Acme Dendon is a 1950s Chicago PI. So do have one story with a PI character who gets pulled into like a Weird West type setting. And it's the longest thing I've ever published. And I when I first wrote it, I had the idea that maybe I'd write a bunch of stories with him and then do a sort of fix-up novel, and I never did any of that. But I was tickled when I grabbed that issue off the shelf today to refresh my memory of it and saw your name there.
Well, can you just let our listeners know where and when this was published?
So it was Story Hack Magazine. I want to say it was issue 6, but I'm working from memory, so I wouldn't swear.
Yeah, that's going to be hard for people to find, unfortunately. Story Hack was in print, and yeah. No, that was a great issue, and I'm going to have to pull that off of the shelf and go take a look at that, because that was a fun issue to be in, because it was very pulpy, but there was a lot of life and verve to the stories in it, as memory serves. So I will have to go reread.
Yeah,
Sheila, detectives and noir and things like that. Do you ever play with those tropes, or do you ever subvert them?
I say never. I have only done such a thing that borders that once. It's just not something that generally I lean towards in my writing.
Okay. That's fair enough. When you write, I'm going to start with you then, so you have a chance to answer a little bit more in depth. When you write fantasy set in a contemporary world, how do you adjust for the reader's suspension of disbelief? Because in a secondary world fantasy, you can make the rules whatever you want, and the reader sort of is along for the ride, and you can make it as realistic or as fantabulous as you want to. But in a contemporary world where we have cell phones and science and everything like that, how do you weave in magic and fantasy in a way that's satisfying to you?
I tend to write from a very deep personal perspective, whether it's first or third person. And so I am always writing from the perspective of my character believes this, therefore I'm going to write it as if it's true. And so for me, it's a matter of writing an authentic character, and whether that character's reality reflects actual reality is a fun thing to play with. There's different ways of approaching this as well. You can approach it in a world where magic exists in our contemporary world and everybody knows it, and it's just part of the world, in which case it's really not much different than a secondary world. You don't have to just, everybody who exists in this world knows this is happening. It's the same as the secondary world in terms of writing it and your characters. But the other way of doing it is that the people who live in the real world are not aware of the magic around them. And that creates a different set of challenges, depending whether your point of view in your story is coming from the people in the real world or the people in the magical world. But as long as every character is being their authentic self, being immersed in the culture that they happen to live in, I think it's going to come across in the story just fine.
I also tend to write very close personal third person, very close personal first person. And I like to get into the character's head. And yes, I strongly agree with you that once you get into their head, you can make reality what you want it to be, and then maybe subvert it a little bit as they start realizing that things don't add up. But Laurence, same question to you. When you're writing contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy, how do you make magic satisfying in a world of cell phones and technology and satellites and everything else?
Well, before I answer that, there's an interesting parallel between urban and contemporary fantasy in this question and alternate and secret history. Because, you can choose to to say, this is New York, this is Chicago, this is Paris. and try to convince the reader this is the real Paris that we're talking about, that they have actually visited, themselves. Or you can say, well, this is just a different world. It may be a different variant of Paris, or it might not even be. It might be, completely secondary world, like Max Gladstone's stuff is clearly urban fantasy in terms of trope, tone, attitude, and style. It takes place in another world with a different history that's apparently disconnected from ours. You could say similar things, and it doesn't have to be completely one or the other. Maybe Mieville's stuff is similar, but some of Murakami's or other writers like him, well, I guess it's our world, but it's so different from ours. I don't believe it. So anyway, what I do to make the magic seem plausible in the world of cell phones and so on, so is this a secret tradition? Does the magic not have grotesquely powerful implications so that anyone using it would take over the world, in some grotesque way, flinging fireballs or, so most often I'm going to try to tamp down on magic's power, or constrain its usage, or have it occur someplace where ordinary mundanes are not going to see it. The usual techniques. You do the same thing for contemporary science fiction or historical stuff where anything changes. But there's probably a week's worth of seminar and interesting discussion about how to achieve verisimilitude, or at least how not to toss the reader completely out of the story. I'm really impressed by writers who can go full on gonzo and just go totally unconstrained, like Richard Kadrey, for example, in this realm of contemporary / urban fantasy. His novels, have grotesque, over the top, super powerful magic. I mean, the population of LA in his novels has probably been killed 3 or 4 times over through magical plague, zombie attacks, angels trying to destroy everything. Who knows? But somehow he manages to make it fun and compelling and not have me throw the book across the room saying this is ludicrous.
What I personally like to do is I like to mix my fantasy and my science, sort of like a peanut butter cup, and I like to have I like to have scientific reasons why the magic works, and I like to have magical reasons why the science works, and so on and so forth. And it's sort of almost like, as you said, about the secret history and the alternate history. I like to mix the two together as much as possible, so that it becomes this confabulation and this structure that the reader says, well, here's some science that sounds plausible. I'll take a step on that tread of the staircase, and then the next step is magic. So, but they're committed now. It's a sunk cost fallacy. They're going to keep going with me. Michael, final question of this section is still, when you're particularly writing in this contemporary world, how do you adjust for suspension of disbelief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm actually going to tangent a little bit to what we started talking about is urban fantasy a marketing term? I think to some extent, yes, but it's also sort of like a label. Like, I know what kind of bag of chips I'm getting if it says barbecue.
Exactly.
I know what kind of story I'm getting if it says urban fantasy or science fiction or whatever. So I think readers tend to come. Readers of genre publications tend to come with a bit of an expectation that they're going to see something unfamiliar or surprising or strange. So I think we get a little grace there in those publications. Probably harder if we're trying to sell things to, say, literary publications. And for me personally, I tend to write stories that I would describe as fairly small scale, like a small number of people, or maybe even just one person who's experiencing something unusual that's happening to them. And there, I think the main thing I try to do is signpost a little bit early in the story about where we might be heading, and then not take a sharp left turn unless it's for a very deliberate effect, and unless I can sort of feel like I've left a couple seeds there where people say, oh, I understand why you went there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I was definitely, when I was reading through the examples of your work that you sent me, I was definitely thinking back to our literary versus genre conversation at the beginning of this series about the smaller stakes and the more personal aspect and everything like that. And you definitely have a tendency to write lit genre. And I think that that's, for lack of a better term, because as we discussed in the first episode, literary has at least 5 definitions, none of which are satisfactory. And I intend this as a compliment towards you, not anything insulting. Please take it as such.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to go ahead and start moving into the second segment of our broadcast, which is when we start talking about all the wonderful things that you guys have written. So I'm going to start with Laurence Brothers with The Demons of Wall Street, which was published by Mirror World Publishing in March of 2020. So it's a COVID story, but not. In this novella, private investigator Nora Simeon is on a sort of permanent retainer to the forces that work behind Wall Street, the cabal of magic users that summons demons to use them for calculations and prognostications, and generally keep themselves in power. Even her mother, one of the most powerful magic users in the Western Hemisphere, is involved in the cabal. Nora teams up with a mysterious man, Air, or Irie, or Air, or however you wind up pronouncing that, to look into a demon that's gone missing and discovers an underground fighting pit full of demons and falls in love along the way. It's a beautiful, moving story that's founded on deeply felt characters, moments, arcs, and absolutely stays true to its noirish investigative roots. I loved this story. It has the urban fantasy trope of the private investigator, but equally so has romantic elements. But would you call it urban fantasy, or would you call it contemporary fantasy?
I would call it urban fantasy because it's so focused on the city setting, not because it's conforming to romance plot structure. It's romantic, but it doesn't have the contretemps and other mandatory elements.
Yes, there's definitely no love triangle. There's definitely no false drama here. There's just a steady, wonderful descent into a companionate relationship that I really appreciated.
Yeah, so I mean that was one of my motivators for the story. Is I wanted to write a Nick and Nora story where the two companions are lovers and friends and respect one another and are just not having problems.
Yeah, it's one of the things that my husband and I'm extraordinarily picky about what I watch on TV, and my husband is less so than I am. But when I bail on a series, and then he about 6 months later he comes to me and says, yeah, they started having false drama, and it would just be so nice if you could have a couple that just got along and just got the work done. Why is this so much to ask?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, though, I was trying to balance a couple of other mashed in motivations for writing this, and so I couldn't start with these two characters together the way that the Thin Man does. I needed to bring them together, and I also needed Nora to be in a pretty messed up state, unfortunately for her.
You succeeded in that.
Yeah, so pretty much with every volume, her happiness, I guess, is increasing, and her ability to cope is increasing. But she, at the beginning of this story, there's not one person in the world she likes, and she is pretty much a jerk too. As a result, the reason I put that in is because I had read Michelle Baker's great novel Borderline, which is another urban fantasy. And that has a character who explicitly suffers from borderline personality disease.
Ooh.
And therefore, despite being an appealing and charming character who you can sympathize with, is also a colossal asshole and is very self-destructive. So I had this insight, the hard-boiled type of character who, from detective fiction or, pulp fiction, who goes out there hammering people with his fists and always getting into trouble. this person is not like you and me, And why are they not like you and me? Well, maybe they have some similar types of problems. I didn't want to go all out and give Nora BPD because, it wouldn't be the right lane, and it would be not just appropriation, but ripping off Michelle's great novel. But I did want to sort of have her be in this messed up state of anomie and alienation, and so the relationship that she gets into starts helping her out, and she and her qualities are balancing out Ira's problems as well. So that's where I went with that story.
No, I was going to ask you where you got the idea for the story and so on and so forth. So you've already answered that question. My final question on this is, where do I get my hands on the sequels?
Right. So they're all available in the usual online shops, but I think if you go directly to Mirror World, the Canadian publisher, they get a larger cut if you pay them off directly.
Okay.
So I would advise
Fair enough.
Mirror World.
I will definitely be looking for them because I really, really enjoyed this. We're going to move now to Michael with another story that I loved. This is Carolina, which appeared in Haven Speculative, issue 2, January 2022. This is a lovely contemplative story about an aging rock musician who had one hit back in the 90s, a song called Carolina, and what happens to him when he's given a battered, new-to-him guitar, which might or might not be magical, but that leads him to play songs that he'd almost forgotten were in his catalog. The right songs at the right moment for the people in the audience who need catharsis or closure, until he's almost addicted to hearing their stories as he was once to alcohol. In the end, he's able to give up the guitar, knowing that it's given him everything that it could give, and it's time to hand it on. This is a lovely story that straddles the line between literary and genre perfectly. It is definitely about magic in the contemporary world, and it doesn't have any of the markers of urban fantasy that we've discussed. It doesn't have a city. It doesn't have a detective. It doesn't have really a romance, other than the lost romance that existed before the story even began. What gave you the inspiration for this story? How did you wind up working it out? And yeah, it's wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I really love that story, and yeah, it's great to see it in print. In print, air quotes, it's online.
Well,
yeah, so as far as the idea for it, I have always sort of been drawn to or interested in artists of various different types who have sort of limited careers, right? One-hit wonders, or actually, I was on a panel last year at Worldcon that I really enjoyed, which was something like Lost Gems or Forgotten Gems of 1946. And I enjoyed going back and looking at old pulp magazines from almost 80 years ago to see, like, where are these authors that we don't talk about today that are virtually forgotten. So I think as far as the character, that's part of what drew me to write about that character. And then the story, if I'm being terribly honest, I don't remember exactly where the idea of the
sometimes
guitar
you can't
leading him to play those songs. Yeah, I wrote the story. Actually, I in prep for this podcast, I spent quite a while actually digging through like early drafts of the story and posts I did on my blog and everything to see if there was something that could remind me of what the germ was of the idea of the guitar. And I just don't remember. But the character, I know why I would have wanted to write about that character.
Well, it's a very character-centric piece, so I loved this piece, and I would really like to encourage people to seek it out and read it. I don't have too many more questions about it because it is a lovely piece of contemporary fantasy, and it stands as a nice contrast to some of the more urban stuff that we've talked about. Sheila, you gave me Fey Magic on a Friday Night, which appeared in Flash Fiction Online in 2023, so earlier this year. This story features what I would characterize as being an unlikable protagonist. There's a trigger warning on the story for assault. So anybody who wants to read it, just be aware of that going in. And it's not one assault, but several perpetrated by the protagonist over the course of 1,000 words, all for the purposes of gathering magic from willing and unwilling Fae. So the protagonist can do nothing more than cast a spell to be proficient at dancing. But it's definitely, to me, it feels more urban than contemporary. It feels like it's situated in the heart of a city. I don't know which city. I suspect New York, but I can't really tell you that. If you want to talk about the city being a character, it definitely feels like there is one edging in there around the edges. Was it risky for you to write a protagonist whose desires implicate the audience as a cohort with them in the assaults? Or was that something you did? Did you do it? Did you do it deliberately? Did it something just develop out of the course of writing? Is this something you set out to do?
No, I definitely set out to do this deliberately. And it's very risky all the way through. It's risky from the point of having to inhabit this character myself as a writer for the length of time that I am writing this character. It's risky in terms of finding people to help me critique it and polish it. It's risky in terms of trying to sell it. And it's risky in terms of what the reader's going to get out of this particular story. So I did do it deliberately. I wanted to see if I could get into the head of a character like this. I think that you're very generous to say that this character is unlikable. I've read lots of unlikable characters, and I wanted to push the boundaries even further for that. I do think this story is urban fantasy. It's the closest of the ones that I have written to that genre or subgenre. It definitely is New York City. It's Times Square. I can tell you the exact hotel because it comes from a real life experience. There's definitely a tension between the real world and the magic world. And if I was thinking about writing more in this world, that would definitely become a key point in whatever story I chose to tell in the world, is that inherent conflict between the Fae and the humans, and that the humans are both attracted to the Fae in a really visceral way, but also repulsed by them. And that would be probably the core of any more stories that I might choose to write in this world.
Well, I think it was lushly written, and it invites you into the perspective, and you find yourself moving into it very easily, but then being repelled by it even as you're moving into it, because the writing is so lush. So you created a nice destabilizing mental effect as you move through just 1,000 words. And I really do applaud you for occupying the mind space for as long as you did to write it, because there have been times when I've gone, no, this particular character is a bridge too far even for me. I am bailing on this because I don't want to be in this head. So, yay.
Well, thank you very much. It was a challenge, but I'm very, very satisfied with the story. And I'm really excited that Emma worked with me at Flash Fiction Online to really polish it up and make it perfect. And I'm so glad it was picked up by them. Really, really.
Yeah, that is really the perfect venue for
I didn't
it.
think
because
I would ever be able to sell the story ever in the real world. So the fact that Flash Fiction Online took it, I was just thrilled.
Yeah. I think that's really the perfect home for it, because they are a risk-taking venue, and that it's nice to see. We're going to bop back over to Laurence for a short story, a flash piece actually, called Captured by the Dragon Cult, published in short edition, and is just as silly and fun as it sounds. This is a flash piece in which a young fashion design student, lured by an intoxicating aroma, ventures where they should not trespass and winds up in a civilized conversation with the dragon, in which they discover that the aroma they were pursuing was the odor of dragon droppings, which, as they express it, is better than Chanel No. 5, which is how they and the dragon both wind up rich. No investigator, no romance, no city, but a contemporary setting and humor make this definitely contemporary fantasy, would you say?
Yes, I mean, you couldn't call it urban fantasy, or I couldn't, because it doesn't hit on the tropes I recognize as being urban fantasy, despite the fact it's definitely in New York City. It's on a number line, which I used to travel myself to get to school from Flushing to Manhattan as a middle school student. And so that was a kind of dramatic change of privilege for me at the time, being able to, at like age 12 and 13, go into the city on the subway. And so there's a lot of emotional power associated with that journey for me, at the time. And so I think that crept into what I was trying to write about here, even though it's purely whimsical, silly, and fantastic. I just happen to have been reading about the evolution of fashion houses. So hence, the allusion to Chanel and so on.
Yeah, the whole Fashion Design Institute and everything like that, it grounds it, and it makes it just real enough that you can sink your teeth into it, and the rest of it is just fun. So I appreciated this one. We're going to bop to Michael again, and this is going to be Scraps, which appeared in Daily Science, the late lamented Daily Science Fiction. So it's a flash piece. This is a moving and a highly effective story about the relationship between a recently dead mother and her still very much alive daughter, playing out through a scrapbook that shows the mother's perspective on what she thought were years of emotional neglect, but turned out to have been moments of hard choices made to support her daughter throughout time. Wow, this was a hell of a story. Why did you decide to structure it, as the title indicates, as scraps, like a piece of wrapping paper, a piece, a third place ribbon, all out of order in a dollar store notebook?
Mm-hmm. In a way, that's probably the least interesting part about how'd you get the idea for this story, because the honest answer is there was an anthology call many years ago now. For stories about books, strange books, and I was like, okay, well, I don't want to write about a strange dictionary or a grimoire or something like that, because I felt like people would probably be writing that. I was like, okay, how can I make this stand out? And I was like, well, I bet not too many other people are going to write stories about scrapbooks. And I was like, okay, well, what can I do with that? And then as far as then the thematic content of the story, we all have experiences of being children. And by the time I wrote this, I had close to 20 years of experience of being a parent. And, you see the world a lot differently for many reasons when you're a parent than you did as a child. And you certainly see events that involve your parents differently. You can see that there may have been things going on that you didn't understand, and that's really the crux of what I was trying to get to in this story. And then the scraps, for me, it was appealing because I've always been a bit of a person who hangs on to things maybe a little longer than they should, and that runs in my family as well. So yeah, the idea of having these little mementos, they're the sort of thing that I would hang on to, and that multiple generations of my family back have hung on to, tying into all these scenes where the daughter then understands that there were things going on that she didn't understand. That was a very appealing structure for the story to me.
It really worked very, very effectively, and it was a very emotional ending, which grab me by the heartstrings. I will follow you. So I'm going to bop over to Sheila again for Combat by Chocolate, which appeared in The Arcanist, August 12th, 2022. I had the pleasure of reading this one when you first wrote it for a Codex contest. I distinctly remember the battle between the ghostly mothers-in-law. So I'm not going to ask you necessarily how you came up with this, because it came up through a prompt and your brain spat out something wildly creative. So I'm just going to say that I'm delighted to be able to share it with other people now in this delightful story. A couple is assailed by a pair of ghosts, their mothers, except that each can only talk to their mother-in-law instead of their own mother directly. And the ghosts have perpetuated their lifelong baking rivalry into the afterlife, clearly a conundrum that only reality TV can solve. This doesn't really strike me as being urban fantasy. It does definitely strike me as being contemporary fantasy. Talk to me about how you wound up writing this.
Well, I was probably watching the Great British Bake Off at
Show,
the time.
yeah.
It's very likely. I'm definitely a bit of a foodie and I'd love to cook, although I don't bake, but that's why I like to watch the baking. And I can tell you what happened. It was the Codex contest. And the week before, I had written a very heavy, very dark story. And I thought, nope, I got to give that up this week. I got to write something light. I got to write something funny. I want to do a ghost story. So that had to do with the prompt. And I thought, I have to write a story that is ghosts coming back for the most ridiculous reason ever. Like, you're not going to move on to the next world because your cake is actually better than,
than your vicious rival, the other mother-in-law.
Exactly. And originally I had the story that they could only talk to their own mothers. And then at some point while writing it, I thought, I have to flip this because that just makes it more funny that you can only talk to your mother-in-law about it. And it was a really fun story to write. And yeah.
Well, it's delightful. So again, everybody check it out. We're going to bop back to Michael for the story 27 Rules for Coping, which appeared in Goldfish Grimm in 2012. A market I haven't seen. Oh, it's already closed. So this is a tightly written, vicious little story about a young woman whose rules for living result in a strained and almost tortured existence when the rules get into conflict with each other, but those rules also keep her alive even when others might not want her that way. We've talked about urban fantasy as the city. There's definitely a city in this. I can't name the city, but it's definitely that pushing in of the buildings around you, sitting on a bus, and the grime of the city is very apparent, and the close proximity of the people, the paranoia, all of that is there. It's sort of in this nebulous zone between urban fantasy and contemporary, but I found it very effective overall. Talk to me about if you can remember, because this was a while ago that you wrote this one, your inspiration for writing it, because each rule has its own place and they interlock like tiles on a game board. So how did you come by this?
Yeah. So yeah, like you were saying with the city being important, that's why I mentioned it for this podcast, because I feel it's probably the closest thing to urban fantasy I've written, even though, as you noted, we don't know what city it's in. So this is probably the one I can best explain where it came from, and a pretty personal story. So having, for as far back as I can remember, having dealt personally with anxiety and to some extent with OCD, and with seeing lots of other people that I know deal with similar situations, I've gotten sort of used to having some of my own rules. They're not nearly as codified as the main characters. And there's lots of times I have to, sort of remind myself that maybe I'm not being rational here. But I was having a moment of frustration one day with how those sorts of mental states can constrain what a person does, and is at least in that moment able to do. And I wrote the story in sort of just a white hot blaze of frustration. It's short; it's 1,200 words or something like that. With just what that experience is like. Drawing on both my own internal feelings about that, and then what I saw with other people.
Well, it definitely, as somebody who I suffer from anxiety myself, so it definitely gave me a lot of familiar vibes, shall we say. And I appreciate the fact that you were willing to talk about it. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
We're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about other people's stories now that we've finished the Mutual Admiration Society portion of the agenda. The first one is by a friend of the podcast, Kate Heartfield, which is The Morning House. It appeared in Podcastle issue 742, July 5th of 2022. In this very poignant story, the protagonist Sylvia believed as a little girl that there was a mirror house beside her parents' home in which everything was better. Her parents got along, there was no divorce looming over her head. Now, as an adult and dealing with all the duties of a caregiver to a father who's got advanced stage dementia, her own daughter leads her to the mirror house again, where her other self is doing somewhat better with the same struggles. She gains courage and comfort from that other self, but at a distance. Do we consider this one to be contemporary fantasy, urban fantasy? What did we like about it? What did we learn from it? I'll turn it over to Laurence.
I'm going to go with contemporary for this one because the city isn't really important. There's a mention of a move from Vancouver at one point, but really it's the house that's important. And also, the tone and attitudes are if you were to strike out the fantastic elements, you could still have a story along these lines in a contemporary literary magazine. Now it's not that the fantastic elements are supernumerary. They're not just tacked on. It's just that there could have been a different story about these subjects. In a literary magazine. So I like this story quite a bit. I think it's unusual and distinctive in a number of ways, like the lack of deep resolution associated with the fantastic element. That's not unique. You see it often in magic realism. But the distancing elements, the fact that the mirror person you don't really ever have direct contact with them. It's only indirect. You don't know really what they're doing. Or what they think, or what their view of their world or this world might be. So there's a lot of mystery to it, and there's also a lot of deep emotion, which isn't explained at tedious length, but is very apparent. So it's very skillfully handled. These issues of delusion, underlying personality elements escaping their bonds, make it so that you are not quite sure, to what extent the narrator herself is reliable. You come to believe in her, I believe, at least I did over the course of the story, due to these secondary bits of evidence. But even so, there's nothing gross. It could have been a combination of her own stress and some delusions and some other random bits of chance. This does talk to that issue of the stress of magic with the natural world in this type of story. It also talks to the plausibility of hidden magic elements, which are not revealed to most people, and when they are revealed, aren't necessarily revealed in a blatant and explanatory way.
Agreed. I was definitely caught by how literary, and again, I hate having to use that word because, as we said in the first podcast, there are 5 definitions for it, and at least one of them is value judgment, and I don't like that. But it has that close personal touch. It's not the end of the world as we know it, but it's there's a sea change in how she sees herself, and she gains strength from this other self that I found immensely appealing. Sheila, what did you think of this story, and did you have anything to add?
I enjoyed this story. The story is the kind of story that I enjoy. It sings to me. It definitely falls into contemporary fantasy. I think it can also walk the line into a portal fantasy.
Yes.
If you believe that the character's reality is manifesting in the world as a portal and a magical place, as opposed to a piece of her imagination that is working through the trauma that she's experiencing. What I love about the story is there's multiple ways of interpreting that.
Yes.
I love stories that are like that, where you can go, ooh, I don't have the answer as to which of these things or which possibility there is here. I choose to believe that there is a portal there, and there is another world on the other side, and there is another her, and they are communicating with each other through these objects and that they're leaving for each other, and that this somehow makes the trauma that she's experiencing, the difficulties in her life that she's experiencing, easier. It brings some comfort to her, and I like the way that it's open to that interpretation.
Yeah, it's a very open story. I liked that about it. It has a grace to it. Michael, would you like to add anything to our discussion?
Yeah, I think Laurence and Sheila have definitely hit on a lot of good points there. I love this story. It's one of my favorites from last year. Two real quick things I'll throw out while we're still talking about it. One is I like what Sheila was saying about portal fantasy, and when we were first talking about this story, it even occurred to me that you could write a very similar story that had a little bit more of a science fictional feel about like parallel worlds, without having to really change much about it. And to be clear, the story is beautiful the way it is, not saying it should be different. But so that those definitions, since we keep coming back to these definitions, you can sometimes end up with a real narrow gradation between the different genres. And like to me, this would have made a great episode of something like a Twilight Zone or Outer Limits or something like that.
Oh yeah,
I wish we had more things like that still around these days. And I think with those, you had things that were clearly science fictional and other things that were more in that sort of for then contemporary fantasy realm.
All right, we're going to turn to our second story, which I will say up front, I had some problems with. There is an issue in this that I find is fundamentally of concern, which is that of consent, and no meaning no, and I therefore had some problems with the story. So this is Play Devil by Josh Pearce and Bourbon Pen number 27. In a fundamentalist church with an unusual tradition of a play devil, a young woman has hatched a plot to steal a turn as the devil for a day to torment the faithful and get in some, not to put it too plainly, some free gropes on another girl that she fancies, which may or may not be consensual. Then the game turns startlingly real as other devils in faceless horned masks come and take away those who pretended to be the most zealously faithful, while the leader reveals his face to the pastor who claws out his own eyes in response. Then the young woman seizes the hand of the girl that she fancies, and they follow the other demons to an abandoned building where, one by one, people either walk into a blinding light or tear out their eyes, except for she discovers that most of the demons are just other people who were too afraid not to pretend to be demons. All but the last, perhaps, as we end on a very ambivalent ending. I'm just going to ask what you thought of this story, and I'm going to take my own opinion. I've already said it, and I'm going to take my opinion out. Laurence, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I really agree. There's some very strong emotional, libido-connected elements in this story. But overall, I found it both dissatisfying and somewhat repulsive. Now, it's not real. I don't think it's really quote unquote urban or contemporary fantasy. It's more horror with some contemporary fantasy elements. Let's say, it's very debatable because these are fuzzy terms.
Yeah.
The idea of this character having these erotic urges associated with the hypocritical play acting done in this church is reasonably powerful, effective, and works for me. That was what the story was essentially about. I wouldn't object to it, but not only does the horror element seem like almost gratuitous, because it's so inexplicable and it doesn't have grounding, in misdeeds or in some magical practice or whatever it might be. And I know that this is not a requirement of horror, by the way, but it's a requirement for me to enjoy horror type stories, though. Not only that, but there's this kind of gross intrusion that the main character participates in along with these other devils, And as you say, there's no consent with this groping bit, or it's not clear anyway. And there, she doesn't receive a comeuppance. The ending is ambiguous, and we really don't know what's happening. So, from the point of view of a conventional, Aristotelian type story, which, again, there's no particular requirement for horror or any genre story to follow. I was expecting there to be that payoff. I was expecting to find out what that big lead devil was all about. It was interesting to me that at least one, if not all, those other subordinate devils were just people who got swept up and were too weak to resist. But it wasn't enough for me, So overall, I was dissatisfied with the story and a little creeped out by it.
I was trying to find if it was like no exit or hell is other people, and if that had been where we ended, I think I would have been okay with it. But the final devil being probably of magical origin, but then we don't know, and yeah, I was having some problems with that. It felt like there was at least two stories here that were sort of conjoined. Sheila, if you would disagree and you liked the story, by all means speak up and tell me that, because I know that you are you are really good about horror, and you are a great writer of horror and dark fantasy. So tell me about this story. What was your reaction?
Yeah, I do love horror, and I do love writing dark fantasy, and I don't think this story falls into either one of those categories myself. I think this is squarely contemporary fantasy, and that it's a story, in my opinion, about our contemporary world where we manipulate each other, and we manipulate each other in some really awful ways. And we assume that other people wearing their masks are devils, and without reflecting back on our own actions or the actions that we're doing to manipulate or harm other people because of our own desires, but also the desires of those who are manipulating us, right? How much choice do the people who have to play the devils have to occupy that role when it's their turn, and the things that they have to do? So for me, this is squarely contemporary and is a really interesting play on how easily people are manipulated into thinking that other people are devils when they're just humans trying to
I like that.
Get through their own people acting on them, and so they act on others, which is not to say that I wouldn't have liked more concrete ending on this particular one. I would have liked to have seen it play out just a little bit longer, personally.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your perspective, because that's one of the great things about this podcast is I get to learn what other people think and see things through their points of view. So I really appreciate that. Michael, could you talk to me about this story and what you liked and what you disliked?
Yeah. This was also one of the more memorable stories I read last year, and the things I liked about it. So I guess first off, I want to walk back to something we talked about earlier, which is that suspension of disbelief. And I feel like for me, reading this story, I felt like I had that suspension of disbelief, but I can also see where, especially after having this conversation, where maybe for some readers it would sort of be like, okay, this has just gone a little too weird for me. I'm not buying it. But for me, I was drawn in by just the strangeness from the very beginning, to my eyes at least, of the whole concept of having the play devil. Certainly not something that was part of my church experience growing up.
Not so much, no.
Yeah, but I almost Googled to see if this was a real thing before the podcast, but I didn't. I do wonder if it is. But yeah, I liked the story quite a bit. I felt like it set very strong mood, had a really good sense especially in the second half, of sort of dread seeping in, and going along with the idea of seeing other people as devils without necessarily understanding them. There is also, I think, sort of that idea that obviously has been covered a lot of times, but of people just going along and doing horrific things in the name of going along, right? The devils that are rounding everyone up and taking them to this place of despair are just other people who just thought that maybe if they went along with what was going on, they would somehow get through. And that's obviously an all too familiar and sad story throughout time. And I think I'm the one person then of the four who liked the ending. I can't defend it. I don't have a good defense for why I like the ending, but there's something about it ending there with that moment where one way or another everything is about to change and you don't know how it's going to change. I liked that. It just somehow that ending resonated for me, and I didn't need to know what happened. I was satisfied just getting to that point with them there, standing there holding hands, about to discover what happens, but that I, as the reader, didn't have to know what happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas I liked everything up to the eyeballs, basically. I like the protagonist's greedy, selfish character because it felt to me like she was rebelling against the hypocrisy of the church, and as strange things began to happen, and she began to feel gratification as a result. Okay, that's a little weird, but it provides a level of transgressional allure, which was effective. Then with the eyeballs, though, I mean, it just seemed like it came out of nowhere. This is the kind of world where a random civilian can see something so horrible that he blinds himself instantly in response, and with no explanation. It seemed like this was a splatterpunk intrusion into a story which wasn't about that. So with no further explanation for it, and without ever getting the chance to see what had caused that, I felt dissatisfied from there onward.
Yeah, that's fair. It was an interesting story, and it definitely has given us all a bunch of different perspectives on it. So we can't say that it wasn't effective. It had a lot of different emotional responses from us. So it obviously creates conversation, which is definitely one thing that stories should do. I'm going to switch gears here, and we're going to have Laurence read to us from one of his stories. Could you tell us which story it is and where it's available, and then take us away for a little excursion into one of your worlds?
All right, so this is going to be from the opening of The Demons of Wall Street, which now has 4 volumes, The Demons of Montmartre just having been released this month. The first 2 are novellas. Third is a short novel, and this is a full-length, over-the-top genre novel, The Demons of Montmartre. So, but The Demons of Wall Street, as you mentioned, was written before COVID, and The Demons of the Square Mile, the sequel, had to try to deal with it. And my way of dealing with it was to say, well, in a world where there was this magic, this is now an alternate history story. Right? So all these people with magic who are behind the financial industry would have intervened because they would have known that the disease would have disrupted trade, as in fact it did. So they stopped it. And now I don't have to worry about people wearing masks. So anyway, here we go. Chapter 1. I was working the action of my compact Ruger, pretending to shoot people I knew, when my phone rang. The ringtone was the opening to Night on Bald Mountain, so I could tell who it was without looking at the screen. Also, the phone answered itself and switched to speaker. It wasn't programmed to do that. Mom, I said, what is it? I imagined her face floating in front of me, aimed, and pulled the trigger. Nora, dear, she said, would it hurt to be polite? To you, yes. I keep hoping if I'm offensive enough, maybe she'll just leave me alone, but it never works. I just wanted to let you know, dear, you have some work coming your way. I thought we had an understanding, I told her. I don't need your money, especially not for some stupid make-work job. Nora, please. This is not my idea, and it's not make-work at all. This is the commission's assignment. I just thought it would be nice to let you know about it in advance. I expect you'll have a case before the day is over. Your first in quite some time, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, well, I said. Thanks, I guess. Don't mention it, dear, and good luck. I think you'll need it. She hung up. Talk about politeness, but she was a big one for last words. I felt a point of heat in my chest. It was Spark, responding to my irritation. So I walked over to the little clay pot by the window where it hangs out while I'm at the office, and sprinkled some more crushed incense to show I wasn't angry at it. Not that I think Spark really understands that kind of thing, but I like to pretend it does anyway. And it settled down, too. The spike of fiery heat became a pleasant emanation of warmth before fading away completely. It wasn't half an hour before someone knocked on my office door. I couldn't be sure it was a commission agent. I do get drop-in clients from time to time, and sometimes people who aren't clients at all. I slotted a magazine into the Ruger and put the gun back in its clamp under my desk. You never know. Then I hit the button to unlock the door. It made a thwacking noise loud enough for the person on the other side to hear. The man who entered paused uncertainly. He was looking around at a tiny bare space just big enough to wedge in an assistant or a secretary in their desk. If I had an assistant or a secretary, anyway. In here, I said, and he stepped through the doorway into my inner office. It wasn't much bigger than the outer one, a mere cubbyhole, but at least it had a window looking down on 35th Street, for what that was worth. Ms. Simeon? He asked. I figured he was a commission agent. He looked like one anyway, in his conservative gray suit with its thin red pinstripe. They like to think they project an aura of authority inherited from their bosses, but really it's more like smug satisfaction at being in on the big dark secret behind all the finance of Midtown and Wall Street. Yep, I told him. The man pulled a device from a pocket that looked like one of the pistol-grip barcode readers they use on checkout lines. He pointed it at me, which made me antsy to begin with, then pulled the trigger, almost blinding me with a laser glare. I came this close to blowing him away because I had the Ruger in my hand under the desk. And then a moment later, when I realized what he was doing, I almost had Spark set his hair on fire. But I managed to restrain myself for the sake of the $100,000 a year they pay me for its permanent retainer. That's pretty much my entire income. The fuck, I said. A little warning first, asshole. Sorry, he said, not sounding apologetic at all. ID. Retina scan. Yeah, I said. What about you? How do I know who you are? He produced a thick envelope from his jacket pocket, put it down on my desk. Heavy parchment, bound with a gold ribbon and a double wax seal. This should be enough. Good afternoon, Ms. Simeon. He turned and left before I could say anything more. I hate these guys, but not only do they pay my rent, there's not much I can do about cutting ties. When you're let in on the secret, they keep track of you. You're either with them or against them, and against them tends not to work out that well. Oh yeah, my mom. She's more than just with them. On their board of directors. Fuck my life. Right. So there was this fancy envelope on my desk. The first wax seal was the commission's, a caduceus with a snake in an S around the rod to make a dollar sign. Occult wisdom and profit combined. Cute. The second seal was blank. I put my thumb up against it and both seals split neatly down the middle. The nicest thing that would have happened if someone else tried to open it was the envelope catching fire. I read through the enclosed material quickly because the ink was going to fade or the paper fall apart in a minute or two. could have scanned it with my phone, but probably that would have cursed the electronics, so I contented myself with making a few notes on a legal pad. The whole first page was pretentious bullshit. Whoever it was at the commission liked to pretend they were old-time British Admiralty. Wherefore fail you not in the execution of our commands, except at your peril, etc. The meat of the case was distressingly thin, but it was my kind of work. Rogue demon, broken contract. The creature somehow managed to sever or refute its binding, escaped from the secure sorcery floor of the Goldman Sachs headquarters building on West Street. Geomantic scrying had failed to narrow down its location, but the demon was thought to be in New York City somewhere. My job would be to track it down and then return it, banish it, or destroy it, in diminishing order of preference. My personal preferred order was the reverse. I hate infernals. I had a contact, a vice president at Goldman Sachs, the creature's supervisor, and that was it. I just finished noting down Miss Saakashvili's contact info when I felt a sudden urge to turn away from the document. When I looked back, it was a Sudoku puzzle. It had always been a Sudoku puzzle. A fucking commission. I hate their little games.
Thank you. All right. So that's just a taste of the story. What gave you the initial idea for the story? You said you wanted to have it be like Nick and Nora from The Thin Man.
Yeah.
So that, and what do you want the audience to take away from reading it?
Well, I mean, there's a very thinly veiled metaphor between late stage capitalism and the sorcerers and demon summoners who are really behind Wall Street. That one of the things I had been doing was researching 14th to 16th century sorcery and alchemy for other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I had discovered that the book of the grimoire called Steganographia, which had been thought to be a book of magical writing like many of the actual grimoires from the period, was actually coded to conceal mathematical codes and ciphers meant for merchants and people like that to send secret messages back in the period. So since I was aware that period grimoires did have many mathematical elements, including magic squares and geometric sigils, I thought, well, supposing in this world it was the other way around, and actually the book of codes was concealing magical secrets, and that really there was sorcery and there was demon summoning. Well, who would exploit it? Well, obviously rich people would exploit it. And why would they stop being rich? Why would they stop being powerful? Well, the answer is, over the last 500 or 600 years since this discovery, which I wound up attributing to Faust, because he was banished from Germany in my history and wound up in Prague, where he never actually wound up. But anyway, putting that aside, the financial industry discovered that the demons they could summon had powers like precognition and treasure finding. And if you look through the grimoires for the attributes of all the big name demon lords, you see a lot of treasure finding and and things like that, because they're all wish fulfillment. Along with another big power is making women show themselves naked. Anyway, so a bank that is capable of summoning financial analysts with these powers is going to trample anyone who doesn't have these powers. So the entire industry had to evolve to make use of demon financial analysts kept as slaves in the interest of capitalism. And so the poor Nora, by dint of her relations with her apparently wholly malicious and manipulative mother, does develop some nicer qualities eventually, but is still not very pleasant. Is subject to this world, is a member of it, doesn't like it much, hates magic, hates demons, and is about to learn better about how messed up her preconceptions are.
I love it. All right. So, next question for everybody is, do you have any upcoming or recent stories you'd like to promote, so long as you're here and you've got people's ears? Sheila, do you have any recent stories or some upcoming stories that you'd like to talk about?
All the upcoming stories that I have are still waiting to be sold.
Oh.
I'm working on right now I'm working on a very, very dark fantasy that I'm hoping to turn into a novella, maybe.
Ooh.
I'm still playing with it. So it's actually a weekend warrior story that I very badly want out in the world. So I'm working hard on that right now. But Fey Magic is the last one that I've published. I do have, if you want to go a little further into the future, I've got a story coming out in 2024 and 2025, but that feels like too far away to even talk about.
Wow. That is way out there.
Yeah, I have an anthology one that's coming out in 2025 and another one in 2024. So, well.
Oh God, that's a long time to wait. But thank you for that. And Michael, do you have any upcoming or recent stories you'd like to promote?
Yeah. So I'm in a somewhat similar position to Sheila, I think. I would say that if anyone found the descriptions of my stories that we talked about tonight interesting, 2 of the 3 of them are in my collection that we mentioned at the beginning, At the Intersection of Love and Death. And that's obviously available on Amazon and places like that. But if you would be interested in a signed copy of that, just go to michaelhaynes.info. And I can send you one. And also then anything new that I have coming out, I tend to post about there before too long.
That sounds fantastic. Laurence, upcoming or recent that you'd like to talk about and promote?
Well, I do have some urban science fiction I'm working on and waiting for publication of. I guess there's a secondary world urban fantasy, but anyway. I have a historical science fiction novella set in Paris in 1967. It's a mashup with spy thriller and romantic baking drama called Pâtissier Étranger, which should be coming out from Bridget's Gate next year.
Fantastic.
And I'm also working on a sort of gonzo noir science fiction, near future science fiction, 2027. So it's practically tomorrow, called Hot Bunny Noir, which I absolutely love.
Oh God, you guys have been fun to have on. Thank you so much for being here. Next week on Shining Moon, we'll be talking with Eleanor R. Wood and Shingai Nijeri Kagunda of Podcastle on the topic of editors and editing. Thank you all for being here, and we are out.